Good evening. I'm Rabinder Singh with the Program Services. Welcome to our great discussion series on world religions. Our guest speaker tonight is Rajiv Mehrotra. He's a personal student of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. He serves as the trustee and secretary of the Foundation for Universal Responsibility. He's also an author, documentary filmmaker, television producer, and director. Tonight, he will reflect on the relevance of Buddhism in modern times. As we begin, a reminder to everyone to add your questions or comments in the chat. Rajiv will address them after his presentation. So welcome, Rajiv.
Thank you, Rabinder. It is a great privilege and a great blessing to be talking to you and sharing some of my thoughts and understanding about Buddhism in general and what their relevance is today. I often start with a story of my own sort of engagement with His Holiness and my qualifications to do this in the spirit of the Buddha himself, really. And so I recall it was 35, 40 years ago, I'd written my first book, and His Holiness was releasing this at a public event in Delhi. And it was a great sort of a moment, a high for me. There were all these thousands of people, the cameras and the press, and so the release ceremony happened, and then he began to speak. And it had this lovely photograph flashing on a large screen of His Holiness and myself and the book in the middle. And then His Holiness said, well, Rajiv is an old student of mine, and he works very hard. But how much he knows, I don't know. And so that was a very sort of sobering moment. And it also was, reaching out to what the Buddha said to his followers. And he said, listen to everything I say and apply reason and logic and listen to it critically, because my word is not final, and that it needs to be processed through your own understanding, your own imperatives, and your own needs. So I really speak as a student of Buddhism, and we have a word in our tradition, sadhaka, which means an aspirant, rather than someone who is a master of his subject. Buddhism is not really a religion in the sense that we traditionally understand it to be. There is no revealed text, no creator God, no idea of an enduring soul that goes to heaven or even takes birth. There is no final authority, historical or living. As I said, ultimately, everything that the Buddha said at his own urging and recommendation is processed and needs to be tested against one's own reason, logic, and experience. And I will be coming back to this very important facet that makes the Buddha's teachings so relevant for our times and the discourse of our times. Today, about 600 million people worldwide describe themselves as Buddhists. That's about 8-9% of the world population. Its influence continues to grow, not just amongst those who describe themselves formally as Buddhists, but many who call themselves friends of Buddhism. And these are people who learn from Buddhist ideas and adopt many of its techniques and practices, most notably meditation. I've had the privilege of speaking to groups of Catholics and who come to talks and teachings in Buddhism, and I sort of asked them, I said, what are you doing here? And they said, well, listening to the Buddha's teachings doesn't dilute or compromise our beliefs in Catholicism, but in fact gives us insights and some specific techniques that we can use to enhance our own understanding of our own faith. And so the Buddha was just another human being, albeit he was born a prince, Siddhartha Gautam, 2,500 years ago. leaving the cloistered luxury of his palace for a glimpse of the real world, he witnessed the inevitability of human suffering and pain, old age, sickness, and death. And he feared this for himself and those he loved. He was deeply anguished over the human condition and the human predicament and the human inevitability of birth, old age, sickness, and death. And he asked himself the question that we often ask ourselves today: why must people suffer? What is the cause of suffering? He kept asking himself. It moved him so passionately that he was driven to abandon the life and promise of a future as a king to find the answer to these questions. And he felt it was imperative that he do if he were to truly serve his people. And he was inspired by the sight of a wandering monk and felt he simply had to leave the palace and follow his example. And that became his quest. As the palace slept, Siddhartha shed his robes and set out alone into the forest in the quest for the wisdom that could bring an end to the inevitability of suffering for himself and, most importantly, his people. So it wasn't merely a quest to find the end of his own suffering, because in the cloistered space of the palace, he had felt secure. He had luxury, he had the best teachers, companions, he was married, he had a child, and a question may not have occurred to someone in that position. But he was equally concerned, if not more concerned, for his people. And that often answers the question: what if he hadn't found wisdom and understanding, and he left his palace and set out and abandoned his wife Yashodhara, his young son Rahul, his parents, and his responsibilities as king? In the Buddhist tradition, the guiding principle was what was his motive. So his motive was not merely the end of his own suffering, but the suffering of others. And so it was an act of altruism, an intention that was much larger than himself. And so he studied and practiced with the most evolved teachers of his time. And remember that even 2,500 years ago, in India, in ancient India, there was the rich Hindu heritage derived from the Vedas, the Upanishads, ascetics and practitioners in the caves of the Himalayas by the flowing waters of the Ganga. So he first engaged in learning from these great masters, to experience what they had to offer. He found a group of ascetics in the forest. The teaching of the masters had been to no significant avail. He very quickly achieved all that they had to teach, and in many cases, the masters would offer him their own seats of learning, as he was the most worthy students. And with the ascetics, he lived 6 years, because it appeared to him that he needed perhaps to go through a kind of cleansing because of the opulence of the forest, and engage in the most rigorous austerities. It is told that he ate 1 grain of rice and 1 grain of lentil a day, until he was reduced to a bag of bones. One day he heard, in this state of emaciation, the song of a wandering musician. If the string is too tight, it will snap. If it is too loose, it will not pay. Prince Siddhartha realized that he must find a middle way. And in the words of the song is the idea of the middle path, which best describes what the Buddha was to embody and to teach. He accepted a fortuitous bowl of rice with milk from a village woman, Sujata. Once he recovered his strength, he sat under a poplar fig tree, the Bodhi tree, in what is now known as Bodh Gaya. He sat in deep meditation, determined not to rise until he found the answer. He was prepared for death if he didn't. So it was with unimaginable determination that he sat and he meditated. Now, we'll talk later about meditation, because today, certainly in the United States, Buddhism is most commonly associated with the practice of meditation. But back to the Buddha. 49 days later, under a full moon, he arrived at the decisive set of insights that freed him from the suffering of the human condition. He had become the Buddha, the awakened one. So the Buddha was not just a title or a name, it was a description. There have been Buddhas, awakened ones before him and after him. But in the tradition that I sort of practice myself and learn from, when we speak of the Buddha, we speak of Siddhartha Gautam, the prince who achieved enlightenment and who awakened to the true nature of reality. The Buddha was hesitant to communicate the substance of his awakening, the experience. The experience was non-conceptual. He didn't know how he could communicate this. It wasn't a revealed scripture. It wasn't a teaching. It wasn't a wisdom. It was a deep-rooted experience and insight. And just imagine that how difficult it is today for us to say someone who has not tasted Coca-Cola to explain what it tastes like, or what coffee tastes like, unless the other person has tasted it. And so he wrestled with this. And when he ran into his fellow ascetics of yore, he felt compelled by a deep compassion for their suffering and of others to try and begin to share this. And so began a very important aspect of Buddhism. So not only did he try and share the nature of that felt experience, but the method, the practice, the technique that would enable an aspirant to experience the same thing. So Buddhism, from its very beginnings, embodied two crucial aspects. And that sort of in traditional, in Sanskrit, in Pali, we would call it the sutra and the tantra. So the sutra became the wisdom, the knowledge, and tantra became the practice or the method. So realization became a juxtaposition of wisdom and method. And you couldn't really achieve that awakening, that insight that would free one from suffering without both. Because the Buddha argued that if it was only a question of the mind, then when challenged by overwhelming emotion or overwhelming feelings, that unless it simultaneously stood up to the scrutiny of reason and logic, that transformation would not endure, and vice versa. So I will try and talk about mostly wisdom and a little bit about the method and share one with you. So in what is described as the first turning of the wheel of Dharma, the Buddha taught the Four Noble Truths. These have formed the core of his teachings as Buddhism evolved and traversed the globe for thousands of years and continues to do so. And so we need to acknowledge these as Buddhists in our lives. And essentially, the Buddha's teaching and method sought to nurture, to cultivate in us, not pure doctrine or philosophy, but an insight and an understanding and acceptance of the true nature of reality as could be intellectually understood and experienced. And so he started with trying to describe this in very brief phrases almost. And so the first truth was the truth of suffering, the need to acknowledge that there is indeed suffering. And even as I use the word suffering, I sort of stop in my tracks because the word that he used was dukkha. And I think British translators of the Buddha's teachings into English have translated dukkha as suffering. It more closely approximates dissatisfaction or discomfort rather than suffering. It is also not to reject or glamorize suffering, but to acknowledge that the human condition in our everyday lives, even when lives of material sufficiency or material opulence or the lack of it, we have gotten used to feelings of not having enough, whether it is emotional fulfillment, so we never have enough love, the right kind of love. We never get the right kind of food, the right job, the right weather, the right president, or the right prime minister. And so the truth of dissatisfaction. The second truth was the truth of the causes of dissatisfaction. And examples of that would be that to strike the right balance, and we need to accept that the reason why we experience dissatisfaction is because our sense of craving for satisfaction or for the things that we want, our desire, our craving, is really the cause of why we experience suffering. Because it's important to add that what the Buddha was not saying was that if you have experienced awakening, that you will no longer experience pain or suffering or dissatisfaction. It is a normal human response to do that. For example, people have assumed that the Buddha would often said, or religious traditions would often say, that give up desire. I think the Buddha would argue that to desire the end of someone else's suffering would be a most worthy desire, or the desire to help people, or to do good, or look after the environment, to do worthy things. So it is located in the context of, in a sense, for want of a better description, to deal with, to accept, and not have one's sort of ship rocked too much by the suffering of suffering. And so that dissatisfaction remains a part of the human condition, but dissatisfied with what? With what motive? And what we use that dissatisfaction for. And then was the third truth was the recognition that there is an end to this dissatisfaction that is possible. And to achieve that was the truth of the path that leads to the end of suffering. And the essence of the path was the truth and the recognition of the true nature of reality. And so the first truth identifies the presence of suffering. The second determines the cause of suffering, largely desire, craving, and ignorance of the true nature of reality. The third truth awakens us to this reality and liberates us from suffering. And the fourth truth, which is really what much of the practice of Buddhism is about, is the method of experiencing the true nature of reality. So, what are the methods? There are these sort of the sutra, the wisdom aspects, and they are foreground by what's described as the noble eightfold path, and these are sort of the ethical values which lay the foundations for Buddhist practice, and these are common to virtually every religion and every tradition: right understanding, right thought, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration, which may be somewhat unique to Buddhist teaching. So I'm not going to delve into that because these are not, I mean, they have a certain sort of spin in Buddhist teachings, but they're not unique to Buddhism other than mindfulness and concentration. And then the path is divided into three themes: good moral conduct, understanding, thought, speech, meditation and mental development. We'll come to that. Action, livelihood, effort, and wisdom and insight. The Buddha, it was very important, to emphasize, asked not to be worshipped as divine, as he himself was human. Like I said, he was born a prince, and he engaged in the practices and techniques that are available to any of us to find similar truths. And like he did, each of us can take responsibility for our own lives and actions and become Buddhas. I will keep coming back to this because it is a very central, almost motif, a teaching in every aspect of Buddhism. That we while at one level Buddhists would argue that prayer can make a difference, and blessing and grace make a difference, but finally and ultimately, we have to take responsibility for our own lives and actions, and can potentially become Buddhas ourselves. And so he, as I mentioned earlier, he taught the middle path. And for most of us, in our everyday lives, that really means navigating our lives between self-indulgent luxury and back-breaking austerity. So it brought to his teaching a quality of lightness, avoiding extremes of every kind. And so the Buddha taught for 45 years after his enlightenment, till he passed away at the age of 80. And Buddhism continued to evolve and adapt to the capacities, vocabularies, and unfolding realities in the countries and cultures in which people lived and traveled to. So what was unique as Buddhism unfolded over 2,500 years, that Buddhism was never a proselytizing tradition, and it got assimilated in numerous cultures, and local cultures, national cultures, and communities, languages, nationalities, and retained its core principles of the Four Noble Truths. And it survives till this day in a myriad hues and mechanisms, and all circumscribed by the universal truths that the Buddha is said to have revealed in what I just described as the first turning of the wheels of Dharma, And then the turnings of the wheel of dharma continued. They continued long after the life of the Buddha, because he had mandated his followers to continue the journey and to offer further teachings and unfoldings of and keep turning the wheel, so that from different perspectives and contexts, this non-conceptual truth could be communicated, taught, and practiced in a diversity of situations and contexts, each of them unique. And so often, Buddhist teachings can appear somewhat contradictory. And that is because we are limited by vocabulary, and the Buddha's teachings have been dynamic, and because they responded to individual specific situations, and so they were expressed differently. And as I will go on to argue later, that even when we talk about a deep understanding of reality, that there is in fact no single reality. And that has very important implications for our times, our fragile, fractured communities that hang on to our own particular notion of reality. But more of that later. So there are 3 or 4, 5, to my mind, universal themes and ideas that underlie the unfolding of the Buddha's teachings, and many of these, in some form, were articulated during the Buddha's own lifetime by the Buddha himself. And it's important to understand these intellectually, and then through practice, along with the 4 Noble Truths. And these are all different aspects of reality which we experience, but sometimes not always pause to reflect and to notice, and to do that and to internalize that can have huge implications for our own sense of well-being and equanimity, and let's just say to diminish our own suffering. And so let's look at the idea of interdependence. We often forget that we live in an interdependent world. And so, even as I sort of drink this cup of coffee, where is it on my screen? Yes, here it is. Early on a Friday morning, and for the privilege of talking to you, and you grab your coffee on the way to work and savor its aroma in the rush to be on time and to hit the ground running, we forget that the number of faceless people that have made that cup of coffee possible, we just take it for granted. And there are that many human beings who just enable that cup of coffee. From the person from the person in Brazil who's growing the coffee, to the guy who processes it, to Starbucks, the person who built Starbucks, to the person who's poured out the coffee for you, the mug in which you drink it, etc., etc., etc. There are dozens of people who just make that wonderful cup of coffee in the morning possible. Today, chaos theory will tell us, and I think this is in more ways than one, that, if a butterfly, flaps its wings in the forests of China, you could have a tornado in the United States, or, what someone does in Russia, on social media can impact the elections on the kind of man who leads the greatest democracy in the world. So we live in an interdependent world, and our happiness, or whatever positive state of mind, depends on other people. It depends on the environment, which our actions can influence. So in myriads of ways. We also tend to forget, we need to remind ourselves of impermanence, that we are so attached to our attachments and the idea that who we are, where we are, and in our relationships, and the people and the emotions that we feel as they unfold are locked in and frozen and will remain the same forever. And of course, it's very easily explained and argued that Mount Everest added a few feet over the last 10 years. The universe is constantly expanding. It's never static. People who we have thought are our enemies suddenly become our friends, and or friends become enemies. Or we know that every cell of our body changes every so many years. Our relationships change. The new cell phone that we buy with a great excitement and pride to compete with others who have better phones will get it scratched and become redundant and obsolete. And so we fail to acknowledge this very important aspect of impermanence. And so when we confront impermanence, we suffer. We experience the pain of it. If we have reflected that change is inevitable, it's going to happen, and not only intellectually, but experientially, we can avoid the suffering of change and find greater courage and self-confidence to embrace change when it occurs. I remember sort of one of my very challenging moments was, when my mother was dying, and this was the first sort of significant death in the family that I was confronting. And so I was weeping. I was sort of all about 40 years old, and I went to see His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, was my teacher, and I said, "Oh, my mother is dying," and I expected him to say, and I went with the expectation of reassurance that no, all will be well. Say a prayer. Have you seen so-and-so doctor? Have you tried so-and-so treatment? And instead he said, well, meditate on death. It's inevitable. It's going to happen. I mean, she may get 5 years, 10 years, 6 months, but it's going to happen. Meditate on death. And I thought that was a very harsh thing to be told, because I'd been to another man of God who had sort of waved his hand and given me some holy ash and said, well, give her this to drink and she will be fine. So 20 years later, it was His Holiness's advice and pointing to the true nature of reality that has stood me in far better stead than the drinking of holy ash dissolved in water. Inherently, when you look at the idea of impermanence, you also look at the idea of change, that everything is in a constant state of change, and that's intrinsically linked with impermanence. And we also know from modern science and reason and logic that, and certainly within the framework of Buddhist tradition, that change involves causes and conditions. It's so that there is change because there is a cause for change. It may be inherent in the object itself, or the personality, or the emotion. It could be exterior to it, i.e., that it responds to that environment, to that change that happens. Again, we know from modern science that we may not always be able to understand the causes for all the changes that occur, but we do know that things change, because we know that nothing is permanent, and quite literally nothing, because even when things appear not to change, it's just that they're changing very slowly or imperceptibly, but they're changing. Now, why are these things important to know? These things are important to know because it is our blindness, uh, uh, intellectual, emotional, and even physical, to these that keeps us from grasping at phenomena and objects. And if you can just try and visualize the fact that we are changing physically, emotionally, intellectually, every infinitesimally small iota of time, and so is the object of our desire or our affection. And so you have these two elements here changing. And then we're trying to develop a relationship of permanence between two elements in constant change. It cannot happen. We can only have the illusion of change, of permanence. And so functionally, we assume a certain element of functional permanence, so that if I'm sitting in front of a computer and a keyboard, I know the keyboard is there and it's reasonably permanent. It's predictable. If I press a key, there will be a reaction. There will be a cause and there will be an effect. The same thing that when we're in love, time seems frozen, and it's very pleasant because we then believe that this is for eternity. But in some cultures, for example, you enter into prenuptial agreement, a contract, if you decide that you can continue to be in love. And that may be a very practical but unromantic thing to do, because I guess, in a sense, it represents a pre-recognition, like a prenuptial, that this may not work, and so we must be prepared. Now, the Buddha would argue that it might be useful occasionally, in the interest of making a relationship, or a relationship, and I just don't mean with another human being. So we need to functionally recognize temporary permanence in order to be able to function. So everything needs to be subject to the scrutiny and to the parameter of reasonableness, and not taken to an extreme. All this then adds up to what is for many the defining concept of idea in Buddhism, which is also difficult often to explain and understand. And I have to say that my own experiential understanding of this is somewhat limited. And that is the notion of what we use. We use various words and phrases to describe it: dependent origination, emptiness of inherent existence, emptiness, and what have you. For those of us who are familiar with the Hindu traditions, a close approximation is Maya, that things are an illusion, but that's not what we're really saying here. But there is a sense of that. And that really means that if everything is subject to change and is dependent on causes and conditions, then it doesn't inherently exist, because it only exists dependent on other factors. A very common example would be, just look at a cube of ice. A cube of ice depends on an external condition, temperature. And if the temperature changes, the cause of water being ice, then the ice ceases to exist. It changes its form to water. If the condition changes further and it becomes hot, it becomes vapor, and so on and so forth. And then it becomes a cloud, and it becomes rain, and it goes through these cycles. So does the ice cube have an independent existence that we can grasp at it? So similarly, the human form is dependent on many causes and conditions. We need a certain range of temperature, we need a diet, We need to be in good health. We need to be, our genes and our organs need to be functioning in a healthy way, and so all these things add up. And so at any time while that we exist and that I'm able to sit here and talk to you depends on many causes and conditions. And so that realization softens our sense of attachment. So just like a relationship is not permanent, it can be enduring, which is different to a quality of permanence, which means that it is long-term but unchanging, frozen in its nature. And so this is a very important aspect of Buddhist practice and philosophy as it has continued to unfold. I'm going to turn to, in talking about the relevance today, to using an example of my teacher. And today Buddhism's best known ambassador is His Holiness the Dalai Lama, who embodies and carries the Buddha's teachings on his ever-smiling face. I've been blessed to be a student of his. And as a Buddhist, to me, he embodies the highest human aspiration, because I see that he walks his talk, and he practices what he preaches, and from a profound integrity and passion and transparency. And one of the most enduring aspects of knowing him has been that when he is asked a question to which he may not have an answer, he's not all-knowing, or he will not acknowledge that he knows if he doesn't, or claim that he knows when he doesn't, he will simply turn around and say, I don't know. And I think the courage to be a fellow traveler, like all of us here are today, whether we are interested in Buddhism or religion or not, I think gives him a great, how do I put it? A sense of enormous power, not in a material sense, but sacred, a subtle energy that people find very moving. And I've experienced this myself. So in his presence, I've seen hundreds of people break down into tears because there is a humanness that is very infectious and touches people, even when contact is for a few seconds. In my early years of knowing him, I would often complain to him of my mundane problems. I manage two not-for-profits, which I struggle with often. And I'd say that, look, I'm becoming a clerk, and so-and-so has happened, and there is this rule, this regulation, and there's a power problem, da 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 da. And so he looked at me and he said, look at me. I lost my country. Look at the condition of the people I have left behind. I live as a guest of a foreign country. I can't travel as I want. I don't get, I was used to the climate of Tibet, and here I am in the heat of India, despite all the hospitality. Now enough of your problems. You solve my problem. And he laughed and he gave me a hug. And so I think it is this intensely human quality of someone who describes himself as a simple Buddhist monk. He's 86 years old. Till recently, he received instructions and teachings from lamas younger than himself. He is an eternal student. He continues to learn. And I think this, again, is in the spirit of the Buddha, that you continue to engage, you continue to learn. The journey is the destination. He teaches us of the enormous value, significance, and potential of India's rich heritage of mind training. And this is something that, I've had a Western education. and we invest, there is the Rubicon of 1,000 hours in training ourselves to become great pianists, to educate ourselves, to get a good job. We balance the amount of money we invest in our education to the income we will derive from the careers it will lead to. We go to beauticians and hairdressers. The latter is not a problem for me. And to look better, somewhat reassuring ourselves that when we walk the streets, people will look at us and admire us for the clothes we wear and the way we look. Yet, we spend so little time in training our minds. The minds that are the source of our experience, the source of our livelihood, the source of our emotions, and the source of our spiritual growth and evolution. And so he's argued for the imperative for each one of us to create the space for training our minds. And we now know from Western science, and he has reached out to embrace a conversation with Western science as to what we can learn from Western science and what Western science can learn from us. And so we now know, for example, that people who suffer from mental disorders or are depressed, when interviewed, have an obsession with themselves. And so there is a frequent use of I, me, mine. So this I, me, my world, this obsession with the self leads to unhappiness and a distortion of the true nature of our perception and experience of reality. So you have methods and training techniques that softens the sense of self. And that really happens through the cultivation of compassion. And we now know that meditation, which is really a form of training the mind on compassion, can cause and lead to enduring changes in the neurobiology of the brain, which can be measured in scans. And some of these can endure for long periods of time, even after we have stopped meditating. So there is a scientific basis that meditation and compassion can, in reality, change the neurobiology of our brain and the emotions that follows. And so there's Richie Davidson at Wisconsin University, John Kabat-Zinn at Harvard, and several others have led and are bringing to fruition more than 20 years of definitive research that confirms this value. And I know that, so if the time is running out, but let me just briefly, talk about meditation. Meditation is an instrument to train the mind, to exercise the mind. And so just like, you can flex your muscles, you can do spot running, you can jog, you can do weights. There are different ways that you can train your body to build muscle. You can also train the mind, both its physiology and the more subtle elements and aspects of consciousness to be healthier. And there are basically two forms of meditation and various variations of this. The first one is really samatha meditation, what we call, and that really the most popular form of meditation in the United States is mindfulness, which is to concentrate on the breath and then to become aware of the unfolding of emotions and bodily sensations, which then in turn offer more intuitive insights into the relationship of mind and body, and enable us through the body and through the breath to access more subtle layers of the mind. But more interesting and more unique to Buddhist practice, and certainly as it unfolds, is analytical meditation. And where some of the things that I have spoken about, such as interdependence. So you do shamatha meditation, you calm the mind, and then you begin to analyze through reason and logic, say the recognition of interdependence. As I measured, you just, you visualize the aroma of coffee, you recognize how many people have made that cup of coffee possible for you. And then the sensation, you dwell on the emotion, the idea, the thought, the sensations, that dwelling on the nature of interdependence and the facts of it, so that it gets more deeply internalized. And so essentially what meditation does is, and why it's so important, is that it helps us move beyond our efforts at conceptual understanding to an experience that truly transforms and impacts our deepest reflexive responses. And that really is the one very significant contribution amongst many of the Indian heritage, and Buddhism is a part of it, mind training techniques that were sort of further developed by the Buddha. So what happens is that you can often intellectually understand things like anger, that I must not experience anger because it's not good for me, or that I should give up smoking because it's not good for me. But when you are able to meditate, you're able to more easily and quickly transform intellectual understanding into a deeply reflexive response. Because in things like when anger comes up, we're not always able to press the pause button before the stimulus to anger yields to anger. So it's important that we are able to approach this right down to the deepest core of our being. And amongst the many things that I talked about, I've spent too much time on this. I think it's also extremely important to flag, two areas, and I think we see that with the Dalai Lama, is that when you understand the true nature of reality and diverse realities. So, for example, quantum theory today tells us that the nature of reality is determined by the presence of the observer. That is science. But Buddhist philosophy has long told us that reality is in fact diverse. And so it's not like the 9 blind men who are looking at different facets of the elephant, and each one of them is looking at a particular facet, and none of them can see the entire elephant. What we're really arguing is that realities are different and are experienced differently from quantum, as explained, and in terms of the many of the experiments. The split experiment, for one, looks at how the observer can impact the nature of reality, and add to that is the respect that Buddhism has for science. It argues that it is not necessary for science to have approved all the assumptions of Buddhist philosophy. But certainly, if there was something that was disproved, then we must accept all forms of contemporary knowledge, process and assimilate it. And as a consequence of that, the Dalai Lama has introduced science education to the highest standards. Well, when I say highest, I'm not talking about deep research, certainly theoretical science in the monasteries. So every monk and nun engages in science, and so this leads to a very vital need, and that is the need to celebrate diversity. And because we're such a divided planet, and it is this recognition of diverse realities and that we can learn from each other that makes it possible for the Dalai Lama to have written a commentary on the Bible. It's called The Good Heart. Get yourselves a copy. I highly recommend it. Bishop Desmond Tutu is one of his best friends, and they've done a book together, The Joy of Living. It is what enables the Buddhists, like the Dalai Lama, to go to a mosque and do the namaz, and walk into a church and hang a cross around their necks and sing a Christian hymn. Go into a Hindu temple or a Sikh Gurdwara, and to embrace diversity and to argue that each of us needs a different mental diet. And so, when asked, when people will talk about converting to Buddhism, the Dalai Lama was always very discouraging and said that, look, you should stay with your tradition because there is a subliminal consciousness that operates, and to sort of deviate from that, could be harmful. And so we do have many cases of Westerners, for example, coming into India, deeply immersing themselves in our culture and traditions, and one day snap, and they come back to what is their own. So you're encouraged to learn from Buddhism, but not to get grounded in them. And I will just end with one of my most sort of moving experiences with His Holiness and the Tibetan community. And in my early visits to Dharamsala, where His Holiness lives, I noticed that the Buddhist monks were praying on prayer mats that said, "Pray for the Chinese," and that their prayers began with, "May the veils of ignorance lift for the Chinese." And mind you, these were people who destroyed more than 1 million monasteries and were guilty of what the International Commission for Jurists described as genocide in Tibet. And so there's gratitude, there's forgiveness. He has celebrated India as the guru for the Tibetans, and people, and the Tibetans are their chelas or students. And I have argued, for example, that that role has been reversed. And well, the final thing that His Holiness ends most of his meetings with me, and I will stay behind I might stay on for questions if there are any, and there is time. He always ends his conversations with me whispering in my ear, "Practice, practice, practice," and that we have to find ourselves a practice, no matter what it is, what tradition it draws upon. And this is not to recommend or urge Buddhism as the final definitive framework for your journeys, but whatever the journeys might be, it is crucial and important to invest time and energy and focus in practice, 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 certainly in training the mind. Thank you.
Thank you, Rajiv. So inspiring. If the audience has any questions, please feel free to unmute yourself or use the chat feature. There's a question here, Rajiv. It says, what is one thing that drew you to Buddhism?
Sorry, come again?
What is one particular thing that drew you to, or attracted you to Buddhism?
Well, it's a long story. It was an accident. And, I went to study in England, and I was at Oxford in the mid-70s. And it was a time of great churning and change. And I was doing theater and, living on the edge. And I came back to India to rediscover my roots and to find stability and solidity. And so I, dashed off a letter to His Holiness the Dalai Lama, because I'd heard of him. I'd already been to Rishikesh on the heels of the Beatles, because they'd been to Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. And so I did a little bit of a spiritual experimentation, and ended up where I felt anchored. And so I don't think there was a single element, and I've just talked about the non-conceptual. So I was deeply, of course, drawn to the personality of His Holiness, who he was, and he reached out to me, and and connected with my reaching out to him in very subtle and powerful ways that are difficult to describe and much too personal to talk about here.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Mine's not a question, but it's a thank you for this. Just the connection with where did your morning cup of coffee come from? Every time I do something now, I write a letter or something, I'll be like, wow, the pen, the paper, the person who taught me how to do that, that's wow. That's wonderful.
Well, it also depends on the kind of coffee you drink.
Rajiv, another question. How does one learn how to practice in analytical meditation?
Well, you find a teacher. There are some excellent books to read. And I think one of the most accessible books is, by the Dalai Lama and a psychoanalyst, Howard Cutler, called The Art of Happiness. And that's an excellent introduction to the Buddhist ideas and practice from a Western perspective. And, if you're in New York, there are many Buddhist centers. And traditionally, the role of a teacher has been held to be very important and useful, because when we talk about particularization or particularizing a teaching for every individual sensibility, a teacher can prove invaluable. And there are also teachings, and this is available in Buddhist literature, on how to judge a good teacher. And essentially, a good teacher is someone who you feel an ineffable connect with. It's intuitive, but there are things that to be cautious about, like in every faith, and particularly in Buddhism, where there is no single titular authority, like in some traditions, like the church, that appoints bishops, and there is a hierarchy. And anybody can put on robes and call themselves a lama. So we have to move beyond that ineffable sense of connect to analyzing the motives of a teacher. And traditional wisdom applies. Is he full of himself? Is he making a lot of money? Is he honest? Is he a person of integrity? It's very often a risk that if we're not careful in the teacher we select, because inherent is a degree of surrender. Because as you take the next step into a non-conceptual world, you don't really know what you're getting into. And there is the possibility of the few teachers who are irresponsible to be exploitive of students. But the best thing is to find a teacher.
Does Buddhism believe in an afterlife?
Oh, yes. Well, not afterlife in the sense that most other traditions do, because we believe in reincarnation. And so, for example, the Dalai Lama is considered the 14th reincarnation of the Dalai Lamas of Tibet. And he is also regarded as the Buddha aspect of compassion. So yes, we do believe that when you die, the subtle mind, we don't believe in a single enduring soul. And if you want to really understand reincarnation, I recommend looking at, I think it was Bertolucci who did this wonderful film called The Little Buddha. And the last sort of quarter of the film deals very eloquently through images and narrative of reincarnation, and that'll give you a sense which is far more intuitive than what I can describe, but I will point to it. And that reincarnation is a very fundamental principle and assumption, and we accept a reincarnation very intimately, because when we look at the idea of causality, in human emotions and human behavior, in our pursuit of happiness, causality is often understood or misunderstood, really, that action X leads to action Y. We know from modern psychology, for example, that all our thoughts and emotions and actions leave imprints on our consciousness. in a form and manner that they can then subsequently impact the actions and feelings and emotions that follow. So it really is a series of all the thoughts, emotions, and actions that we experience, or we are auteurs of, in a sense, create this matrix of potentialities and manifest and expressed in the biochemistry of the brain. And so the practice of Buddhism, specific practices of analytical meditation, for example, of course, more generalized ones, a teacher will identify these that are the best antidotes to your current set of current matrix in the consciousness, as making you feel and behave the way that you do. At a very sort of gross level, what mindfulness does is sort of similar to what a modern psychotherapist might attempt, is to lead you into a conversation, a stream of consciousness, where your thoughts and repressed emotions and ideas and feelings come to the surface, with the assumption that they then get released and you are free from them. But I think even Freud argued that that could reduce suffering, but not bring you to a level of, want of a better word, happiness. I mean, I'm always reluctant to use the word happiness because of its association with the promise of the American Constitution. So let's just say equanimity or contentment, or the absence of suffering. So that is something that we carry from lifetime to lifetime, because that when we believe in causes and conditions, so when we take birth, when the sperm and the egg, come together, it's sort of a loose consciousness as opposed to a soul, and that's for another talk on another day, the difference between that, finds a mother, as egg and a sperm, that best express or manifest the imprints in the consciousness of the person is individual, carries forward from one life to the next. And so the continuity of consciousness is extremely important, and even more so in the tradition of the Dalai Lama, and because we have the idea of a bodhisattva. And traditionally in Eastern philosophy, certainly in Hinduism, the aspect or the aspiration of awakening is to break out of the cycle of birth and rebirth, and to merge with Brahman or universal consciousness, and to be free from suffering in that manner. But in the Mahayana tradition of Buddhism, the bodhisattva ideal, it really is to attain enlightenment or awakening, so that you can consciously steer your consciousness, or actually subtle mind, clear light, the different words to describe this non-conceptual experience, into taking human rebirth in order to teach and serve humanity. So you voluntarily embrace the suffering or the pain of the human condition to relearn or revisit that process of education and learning, and then to share that with humanity. So even though the Dalai Lama is a reincarnation of his predecessor who was an awakened mind, the young Dalai Lama, when he is discovered, and the present one was discovered at age 4, went through the process of training and learning that other lamas do. Now, it is recorded that he learned very quickly, much faster. And just to make sure that they didn't get it wrong, he was also subjected to public debate and engaging in debate with other masters before the larger community, to demonstrate that he had acquired the insights and wisdom to be able to hold a chair of the Dalai Lama. So yes, reincarnation is a very important principle, but it isn't after life, because it's not life in the sense that you and I are living, and so there is a continuity of consciousness, of subtle mind. And one day when I have experienced it, I will try and describe it better. In the meantime, I will just have to live with my inadequate words. But thank you for the question. It's a very important principle in Buddhism.
Thank you, Rajiv. Very enlightening as always.
Gosh, that's a biased friend.
No, truly.
Rajiv, you've touched upon it, but there was a follow-up to that which said, do Buddhists believe people are reincarnated for eternity?
Theoretically, yes, because but we have to keep in mind that what I explained before, that a person who believes in Buddhism would also believe that you will keep repeating the cycle of birth and rebirth as a sentient being. And by a sentient being, we mean any being that has consciousness. So it could be as an insect, it could be an animal, it could be a god. And we have different layers of beings, and there is a belief in God, but not a creator God in the manner that we believe in many other traditions. And so, yes, you would go on eternally into this cycle. And if you followed one of the schools of Buddhism, which is a Theravada school, it would argue that it is possible to break out of this cycle when you attain awakening. But in the Mahayana tradition, which we practice, that you would choose to keep coming back in human form eternally, to keep teaching and serving humanity. And hence the enormous emphasis and compassion, not just as a technique for us to deal with our struggles and our pain and our suffering, but as the primary driving force for our existence in human form. I hope that makes sense.
I have a question for you, and that is, do Buddhists actually worship anything, as in worshiping God or worshiping the Buddha or anything else? Or is it just a system of beliefs?
Well, we would argue that it is not a system of beliefs. It is a system of experience. So there is a difference between belief and experience. You can believe something, but unless you have experienced, it has to be validated, as I mentioned, with reason, logic, and experience. So it is not a sort of a distant belief. I believe this. So it is like knowing, if I put my finger in fire, that it will burn. Having said that, yes, worship can be and is often an important part of Buddhist practice. But as I mentioned, that we do not worship a creator God, which means an absolute final God. Worship is a device, and it derives from the Indian tradition of deity worship. And there is frequently debate in the Hindu tradition is, does a deity actually exist? And for us Buddhists, the deity exists only to the degree that we create one for our use, terrible word, but for our needs. And that is not as difficult to understand as it might appear, because just as we find, say, different landscapes soothing or different sounds soothing, or, a lot of work has been done on how colors impact mood. A red can stir you up, a blue can calm you, or different forms and shapes can impact how we feel. And so the Buddhist masters, in a sense, have almost designed deities with different symbolism, who you evoke or invoke and meditate on and visualize. So visualization is a very useful and common form of practice, so that you can then impact your subconscious with the elements that of the deity and what they evoke. So, for example, in my own case, at one point, His Holiness had felt that I was somewhat timid and shy, and so I began working with a wrathful deity. For want of a better word, an energizing wrathful deity, who actually was an embodiment of compassion in terms of its personality and character, so that the elements of that visualization, the color was red, and the sound, the mantra, the holy sound associated with it was, how do I put it, had the rhythm to it and was uplifting, so that it would aid my process of transformation or realization. So I would mentally create the causes and conditions in my mind for the existence of the deity, visualize the deity, and then devolve or dissolve the deity back into shunya, or emptiness, which I had attempted to describe. So the deity and worship in Buddhism is often in that form and manner, including the worship of the Buddha. So, we have no idea if the Buddha looked exactly like he is worshipped today. And this is how in different cultures and different sensibilities, they evolve the images and they evolve the form, the expression, the colors associated with the Buddha that best respond to their culture or their culturalization, or the culturalization of their sensibilities, so that it can be most useful and effective for them.
Fascinating. Thank you.
Rajiv, there's another question in the chat. It says, does Buddhism believe in evolution? Where did the consciousness exist before humans?
Well, like I said, Buddhism believes in science, in the sense that scientific reason and logic. And so it would have to believe as of now, till it is disproved by maybe future science, in evolutionary biology and the principle of evolution. The reason why Buddhism actually doesn't have an answer to this is because the Buddha felt that this was a distraction to get into metaphysical questions such as the origin of the universe. Does God exist? Or what happened before man? And when did consciousness begin? Because they were distractions and could only be explained through the principle and process of causality. So when it turns to modern science, it looks at and says that, well, modern science tells us that the beginning of the universe was the Big Bang. But then the question comes, what happened before the Big Bang? And then what happened before that? So a useful example of why the human mind sometimes needs to give up is that, when we study math and, you look at dividing, a figure by, divide what, an odd or prime number, I get confused. But, you arrive at a 3.333 when you try and divide 10 by 3. You get 3.333. And at some point, you just decide that there are enough 0.33s that they cease to matter. And then you just stop there, because the human mind cannot grasp the notion of infinity in concrete terms, in tangible terms. So in the most complex of calculations, at some point, you have to say that this is far as we can reasonably go. And speculation beyond that is not useful. And it could distract us from our pursuit of compassion, of leading useful human lives, and to break out or to seek our place in the cycle of birth and rebirth. So that is why it is not that Buddhism does not believe in God, because many of these answers come from ascribing them to what the scriptures of the gods say. So we just decided to put that aside, and hence, Buddhism is not atheist; it is agnostic. So our position on these is an agnostic one.
Thank you. While we can sit here all evening listening to you, Rajiv, but I have to be mindful of your time. So thank you once again for sharing your experiences with us.
Thank you. It has been a great blessing and a great learning for me.
And please feel free to come back anytime and grace us. Thank you all for participating tonight, and good night, everyone.
And thank you, everybody, for being here. And I'm not sure it's politically correct to say so, but stay blessed and stay well. Corona is raging in your part of the world.
Thank you.
Stay